Good morning, friends. Let's build on what we talked about yesterday by going to 1 Peter 1:22, where we read, "Having purified your souls by your obedience to the truth for a sincere brotherly love, love one another earnestly from a pure heart." Now, in the context of this passage, Peter is talking about living a holy life in light of our salvation. That since we've been saved and born again, this is how we ought to live. And we, of course, see that familiar phrase, "from a pure heart." Having been saved by God, having submitted ourselves to Him, this purity of heart ought to be one of our primary motivations, which is something we'll talk about in more depth tomorrow. But in this passage specifically, let's take a look at what comes out of that pure heart. Because Peter says obeying God's truth leads us to love one another earnestly from a pure heart. And this builds on the fellowship that we talked about yesterday. Because if we desire our own hearts to be pure, and God is making our hearts pure through sanctification, then that motivates us to love one another. And if we long for that purity in our own heart, we will also have a desire to love our brothers and sisters in Christ. And if we look at this passage in light of yesterday's passage, a huge part of the love of that love will be the desire to maintain our brother and sister's purity as well. So in that Christian fellowship, we're going to look out for each other. We're going to love one another enough to take a vested interest in each other's lives. And we're going to keep pointing each other past ourselves to Christ. In today's passage, the basic message is, if you've been raised with Christ, then love one another. In Colossians 3:1 we read, "If then you've been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God." We see then that there are many things that result from our salvation, from having been raised by Christ, and they all go hand in hand. We maintain a pure heart by diverting our eyes away from sin and temptation so that we fix our eyes on Christ. And out of brotherly love, out of Christian affection, we do whatever we can to help our brothers and sisters in Christ to keep their gaze fixed on Christ as well. Now, yes, can that sometimes come across as badgering or prying? Do we need to be aware of going to the other extreme and then falling to the temptation of gossip or making hypocritical judgments if we try to fix other people's spiritual walks while our own are in shambles? Yeah, we need to be aware of those very, very much. But we must understand here and now that the scriptures tell us to love one another, and that means being a part of each other's lives, a significant part of each other's lives. It is downright dangerous, not to mention contrary to God's will, for a Christian to shut out other Christians, especially if they then turn instead to people in the world. And when we find ourselves doing that, the most common reason is because we don't want to be confronted with the reality of our sin. There are other reasons this might happen, of course, but that's the biggie, and we must avoid it at all costs. And it's my hope that we are developing a Christian community here that is far more than a community, that it would be a family far greater and different than any other earthly family, but that we would have a godly fellowship of believers where we would trust one another, that not only are we willing to go to that other brother or sister to assist them, to encourage them, perhaps even to confront them lovingly about an obvious sin, but that we would be prepared and willing to let others help us in the same way. That when we fall into sin, that we would not fight back, but that we would accept our brothers and sisters' loving correction. I pray that in the desire to keep our collective eyes fixed on Christ and to love one another, that we would be a repenting people and a forgiving people. That when we sin, and sin we shall, but when we sin, we would turn away from it and seek forgiveness. And then on the flip side, we would readily and lovingly give that forgiveness, and then never use that sin against that person ever again. And it all comes down to those pure hearts, the pure motives, intentions, and desires, that we love one another, and that our interactions aren't based on pride or hypocrisy or the perverse joy of spreading gossip, but that we would be legitimate brothers and sisters who love each other from pure hearts, recognizing that we each have been saved by the mercy and grace of God. Therefore, we have an inordinate amount of mercy and grace to show toward one another. Let us take these truths and plant them in the very core of who we are as God's children. To that end, I say have a good and godly day, and the Lord willing, we'll have fellowship together soon.